So I'm sorry in advance if you see me reading. I did prepare the script in advance, and I wanted to make sure that I say everything that I want to say and not go too much off script, or I'll be here talking for God knows how long. So, anyway, as someone who specializes in community mental health, abuse, and manipulation, I could no longer remain silent about this. As you know, my channel is rarely political, but this is not political at all. This is so much more than that, and you will understand as you listen to this video. What has happened in Iran is something that might seem very familiar to people who are familiar with coercive control. This is how cults operate. This is how narcissistic systems remain in power. Fear is enforced and obedience is rewarded. Except in this case, the reward is survival, which is often the case when it comes to emotional abuse. Resistance is publicly destroyed so everybody understands their place and learns the lesson. And the most shocking part about this, and why I am so vocal about this, is that people are not being killed because of war. They are being killed because they are not submitting. These are two very different things. Taking sides is problematic, even more so when the motivational factor is people refusing to submit. There is this huge hypocrisy when it comes to talking about Islam and Islamists. And if you follow my other channel, Jennifer Rolls, you will probably know that I'm quite familiar with the gaming community. And this is going to come up now because I heard a lot of people getting vocal and being loud as hell when EA was bought by Saudi Arabia. And a lot of people, especially in the Sims community, said that they were going to boycott The Sims because they do not support Saudi Arabia, because they only recently found out that Saudi Arabia is not nice to LGBTQ people. People became outraged like this was news. And I understand, because in the West, especially in certain countries in the West, there is not that much awareness to what goes on outside of the West. But this was odd to me from the start because the focus was only on how a country like Saudi Arabia is oppressive and abusive to LGBTQ people, ignoring completely that the problem is a lot bigger than that. These regimes, this regime, is not only oppressive and advocate mistreatment of minority groups, it is mistreating people that make up part of half of the population. That is women. Women are not allowed to exist without permission. They don't have a voice. And this is the example of Saudi Arabia. But we have this example in pretty much any country where Islam is the driving force, where Islamists are the head of the government. An Islamic regime is killing people publicly, executing them for saying that enough is enough and that they will no longer be oppressed. And what is most frustrating about this, besides the fact that it's a massacre, is that the West remains silent. And I have a question. I have a legitimate question here. Where is the noise? Where is the revolt? Why is everyone so quiet? Well, I know the answer to this because this is what happens with coercive control. This is what happens when societies are manipulated long term in a way that is so quiet, but at the same time very loud to our subconscious minds, to the point where we know that if we talk about something, we might get threats. We might be putting our lives at risk, which happens to the people who speak out against these regimes. It has happened in the past, it happens in the present, and most likely, if there's not a change, it will happen in the future. Islam killed thousands in days in Iran for revolting against their oppressive system that has spent decades dismantling their culture, their freedom, and their livelihoods. And that needs to be said clearly without euphemisms. And the silence is the problem. But we need to understand why is there silence to start using our voices, to start being loud, to start being the voices of the people who need. Protecting Islamic regimes, as I said before, it's not news. And it is the protection of the abuser. Something that, again, if you are familiar with this channel and what I talk about here, especially with the coercive control and manipulation, you know that this is quite usual. And you would also know that I do not stand for that. So I want to dig deeper into it all today. And there's a lot to talk about, so get ready. And the pattern is very old. Point the finger at the West, call it uniquely oppressive and patriarchal. And yet here in the West, I am allowed to show my hair. I'm allowed to speak my mind. I'm allowed to be myself fully, regardless of being a woman or a man. Meanwhile, Islamist regimes have brutalized their own population throughout history, and they are still treated as sacred ground, where criticism is forbidden. And that is how abusive systems survive. That is how oppression survives. That is how people continue to get manipulated into staying silent. And as someone who has survived abuse and been tortured at the hands of manipulation and emotional manipulation, I don't just watch things like this happen while staying quiet. I can't. This is very common in cults. Outsiders are framed as the enemy, and internal violence is justified. The victims are told that their suffering is necessary, even sacred, to their gods. And anyone who speaks up is accused of hatred, of ignorance, of betrayal, even. And the same psychology is at work here, just scaled up to millions of people. If we remain silent, it not only keeps these systems intact, it keeps the victims trapped. And it teaches people that survival is based on compliance, which is often what happens when people are in a domestic violence situation where they know that if they're silent, if they're quiet, if they're accepting, if they find an excuse for what they're going through, they can survive another day in that situation. They can let another day go by. They know that if they speak out and their abuser finds out, there's going to be problems, often in public, but more often behind closed doors. This is the reality of domestic violence, is the reality of people that are in cults trying to get out, and it's the reality of Islamist regimes, such as the one in Iran. And staying silent is understandable when you are the victim, but very often people that are around the victim know what's happening, and they stay silent too. Often to not get involved because they already have enough problems of their own. But as someone who was the victim in the past and had people witnessing it and staying quiet because it wasn't very convenient to talk, I find it terribly sad, and that's why I refuse to stay silent when I witness things like this, especially at this scale. The numbers are absolutely brutal. As of January 16th, 2026, Iran International, quoting senior government and security sources, reports at least 12,000 civilians killed by their own government in what is already described as the largest killing spree in Iran's modern history. Not only this, but the regime enforced a total blackout in 2026, where people cannot call their loved ones to know if they're okay. They cannot text message. They cannot email. They're living in angst trying to contact their loved ones. And the most shocking thing about this that we have to keep in mind, and that many people, even I, before digging into this a while back, had no knowledge of, was that Iran is not some isolated, impoverished country where the infrastructures just happen to fail. Iran is a very advanced country. And it was advanced and considered a first world country back in 1979, before the Islamic Revolution. Persia was known as a modern, developing nation with culture, science, education, and global relevance. And the one thing that changed and turned Iran into what it is now was the Islamic Revolution, Islamic takeover. And finally, almost 50 years later, people have had enough and they found courage and they spoke and they resisted. I watched a video of an older lady who is at a protest and she was screaming, "I have been dead for the last 40 years. I am no longer afraid." If that doesn't send shivers down your spine, I don't know. Maybe you're not understanding the whole situation, but I'm here to explain. And again, these deaths are not casualties of war. They are executed one by one, picked and dragged by Islamists because they refuse to submit, because they have had enough, because they want a voice. Doctors that are inside Iran have said that what we are seeing here in the West of what's happening in Iran barely scratches the surface of what's really happening. The hospitals are overwhelmed and gunshot wounds are close range. And the scale of injuries defies belief, and most of it never reaches international media because international media cannot point the finger at an Islamic regime. Islam must be protected at all costs, even at the cost of thousands of lives. Citizens are unarmed. They're simply using their voice. That is their weapon. And yet, for using their voice, they are being silenced through death and through the cutting of all communication lines. And this is the exact same tactic that abusers use. Isolate the victims, remove witnesses, and make the harm invisible to the public eye, where no one can see it and no one can help. And despite this, there are still a few fragments that still escape because of Starlink satellite smuggled in by activists in Iran to allow a little bit to come out. But even the partial reporting shows that the violence is nationwide. And the regime justifies these killings by branding protesters enemies of God. But what kind of God would advocate for the death of people just because people don't want to remain silent? It makes no sense to me, because if there is a God and God gave you a voice, it's for you to use it, whether you're a man, a woman, a child. If you have a voice, it's to be used. And yet murder is sanctified by religion. And you could argue that this has happened in the West. Yes, but in medieval ages. That's the difference. We are in the 21st century. And apart from one or two countries, wherever Islamic regimes rule, civilization evolution seems to stagnate. We are in the 21st century where freedom is pretty much a given. And yet for these countries, it's something that you have to fight for or give up on having altogether. And yes, we already know that the numbers are terrifying, but there are some names that we can name of a very small percentage of the victims. I'll give some examples, though, to keep this less abstract. A hairdresser and nail technician from Kherson was shot in the face by security forces during protests on January 3rd and died of her wounds the next day. Videos shared online ignite the outrage because her only crime was refusing to submit, and she was executed publicly. Other reports also confirmed that students and young protesters are dying. A Kurdish student was shot point-blank range by government forces in Tehran during the protests, leaving her family unable to bury her under normal circumstances because the authorities imposed strict security restrictions. Independent groups like Norway-based Henga estimate at least 2,500 protesters killed, with countless more missing or unidentified. And that death toll keeps climbing as Tehran speeds up trials and announces more executions for waging war against God. Hospitals that have documented cases show hundreds of severe injuries, including dozens of people shot in the eyes with metal pellets. This is meant to terrorize people, not control the crowd. Deep down, the regime knows that they have lost control, so the only way that they can somehow silence people is either by ending them or terrorizing them. Our security forces in medical facilities preventing injured people from being treated. Many people are given 10 minutes or less to say goodbye to their families before being executed brutally. And this is justified publicly under some religious law. And these are some high-profile cases. Imagine all the other ones. Imagine the dozens, hundreds, and thousands already erased whose names are just lost and whose families are crying in silence. That's horrifying. Young women and students and activists whose lives are just snuffed out. Many of these deaths are part of the women life freedom movement, where young Iranians, especially women, risk everything for basic rights, dignity, and autonomy. They demanded freedom by marching and chanting, and for having that courage, they are gifted death. And we have to keep in mind that the same groups that enforce this kind of violence also manipulate the discourse on the West. The fear of being called an Islamophobic is used as a weapon. Muslims, non-Muslims, and ex-Muslims alike are told that questioning their ideology is betrayal. And dissident voices, human rights activists and defenders and journalists, basically anyone who speaks the truth, is silenced or smeared and labeled with things such as Islamophobic or racist. And in fact, many ex-Muslims who speak out against a religion that they realize functions as a cult, one that oppressed them for decades, have to hide their faces or stay surrounded by security at all times. Others risk their lives every single day to raise awareness, so we can hear them, so we can hear their voices, showing themselves despite the constant death threats. Some of these brave voices include, and I'm sorry if I'm saying the name wrong, I'm so sorry, Ayan Irsi Ali, Yasmin Muhammad, Apostate Prophet, the Cyberpunk Dingo, Farida Aurelius, Nuria Khan, Sarah Gorbani, and Goldie Gamari. And there are so many more voices out there. I could not list them all. These are only a fraction of them, but if you are one of these voices, please reach out, comment, anything, because anything that I can do to amplify your voice, I am more than happy to do that. But basically the messaging is really clear. You challenge us, you are framed as a bigot, a traitor, or a colonizer. And the silence around the Iran situation is the perfect example of what we know as social conditioning. Across the West, political parties and public figures who point their fingers at the Muslim Brotherhood or other Islamist organizations get torn apart instantly. They are accused of targeting minorities, accused of bigotry, and accused of cultural intolerance. Basically, the discussion is shut down before it even is allowed to begin. Again, silencing, because it's the best way to keep people in check. And the same excuse always appears. Islamists are a minority, minorities deserve protection, their culture deserves respect. I'm sorry, but a culture that oppresses women and children, silences them, tells them that they are less than human, compares them to farm animals, tells them that they need to hide their hair and their faces because they are a temptation to men. That's not a culture that deserves respect. That is not even culture. The real culture of the civilizations from those countries was erased by Islamic regimes. And we would know this if we hadn't been so manipulated for decades, being told that even thinking that is being mean and phobic. And that's the kind of framing that protects power. And here in the West, we are always told that Islamic movements are powerless and they're a minority. There's not that much awareness to historically how that is actually not true at all. Islamist movements are organized, ideological, and aggressive. Very aggressive. They operate through intimidation, religious authority, and social pressure. And they control their communities through fear and obedience. And their ultimate plan is to export that control to wherever they're able to gain influence. And they're only able to gain influence if we allow them to do that. If we continue to pat their backs and say, oh, but you're a minority, we accept you, you're one of us. No, you're not. You think women are less than. You think children don't deserve protection and respect. You're not one of us. And we have to get something straight. Criticizing Islamic regimes is not racism. And it's not intolerance to other people's culture. I love learning about other people's culture. When it comes to Iran, for example, if you want to respect Iranian culture, learn about Persia. Learn about what Afghanistan looked like before a regime took over. Learn how all these other countries, all these other women dressed and how they expressed themselves before Islamic regimes took over. They had a voice and they were allowed to exist. But then in the name of religion, things suddenly just were erased. And this is not an attack on freedom either. It's just remembering history, to be honest with you. We can look at this through ancestral memory as well. Because if you don't know this, I dug deep into the history. And for centuries, Islamic empires occupied large parts of countries such as Spain and Portugal, starting with the Umayyad conquest in 711 CE, lasting nearly 8 centuries in some regions, until the completion of the Reconquista in 1492. Local populations lived under foreign rule, Islamic rule, subjected to religious and legal systems that controlled their daily lives, limited freedoms, and enforced submission. People tried to resist as much as they could, and kingdoms like Castilla, Aragon, and Portugal fought war after war, decade after decade, to reclaim their lands, their culture, and their autonomy. See, it's ancestral memory. Feeling fear of regimes such as the Islamist regime is ancestral memory. It's engraved in our DNA. These are generations that endured oppression, sieges, massacres, forced conversions, having to pay an extra tax because they did not want to convert. And they endured all of this to recover the freedom that had been taken away from them. And yet today we're told that Islam is a poor minority that needs to be protected, rather than a historical system that repeatedly enforced control and terror wherever they passed. Yet calling this out, and me calling this out, gets people punished. Careers are put at risk of ending or just not starting at all. Reputations get smeared. And suddenly we start experiencing in our own skin what people, women in these regimes experience every day of their existence for speaking clearly. And this kind of fear is the social conditioning I was speaking about earlier. It's the kind of fear that shapes public behavior. And abuse thrives when women and children are controlled and silenced and groomed and married off without their consent and beaten and erased. And this is a reality that doesn't change because suddenly we decided to call it cultural. And it doesn't become acceptable because it's wrapped in a bow and called religion. And this same mentality appears again and again in Iran, in the Middle East, in Western cities, in grooming gang scandals. There are abuse cases that are buried for years because our authorities didn't want to appear insensitive. And meanwhile, the victims that experienced this knew, their communities knew, and yet the institutions decide to stay quiet because they're afraid of being called names, as if external validation should really matter. In this channel, we talk a lot about mental health and about becoming more empowered and learning to break the shackles of control and manipulation. And this is one of the things that is very important, is we should not live our lives craving external validation, being a people pleaser. And yet, for decades, as a society, not only just as individuals, because everyone has a different life experience and you might not have experienced emotional or physical abuse in your personal life, but as a society, we have been conditioned to be people pleasers and worry about what other people think and be validated externally. But the whole point of living a healthy, empowered life is not caring about external validation. And this is one of the ways we can start doing that, is by thinking what makes sense, what doesn't, and defying what kind of labels we might get put on ourselves, on us. And we see this a lot. The more the West becomes politically at war and where there is division among the people, we start seeing that there's this cult thinking that is taking place where loyalty to the group that you support matters more than the truth. And that ultimately alignment matters more than the victims. So if the political party that you wouldn't vote for raises an issue that actually makes sense to you, you are more inclined to dismissing it. And if the wrong person actually says something accurate, it gets instantly rejected. That's cult thinking. And it trains people to suppress their own critical thinking, and it conditions people to suppress their own judgment of things around them. And it trains them to stay quiet even when they feel that something is clearly wrong, even if their gut feeling just tells them that there's something deeply uncomfortable around them, but they feel very conflicted because everything becomes political and nothing becomes just logical. And this shouldn't be a surprise, really, because cults thrive when people feel isolated and lonely and feel this need to belong and feel the need to be part of a community. So it is, as humans, we are wired to prefer to belong in a community, even if it means denying some of the realities we actually see. But while we're arguing here over optics, there are people that are being executed for wanting to just exist and live their little lives. We should all be allowed to live our little lives. And while we are also here talking about optics, Islamic groups are preparing to spread into other civilized countries, trying to turn them into controlled states like they did to Iran. And this is not extremism. This is a reality that many governmental entities are already seeing, kind of. And I believe that there are a lot of empathetical people out there, regardless of who they vote for. Inside of them, there is empathy, but that empathy often gets exploited, and people get trained to fear accusations. And as people from Western societies, we carry this really heavy load of historical guilt that has been inflicted upon us, from colonialism to imperialism to slavery. And yet, for some reason, which we already talked about, what might these reasons be, Islamist movements have learned to exploit that. Where when we point the finger at oppression and repression and coercion that they are inflicting upon their people, it instantly gets reframed as Islamophobia. And then people hesitate. And I believe that most people want justice and most people just want to live their lives in peace. But they get tangled up in these worries, especially paralyzed by the threat of being called intolerant. That's also why Western missteps are really loud and immediate, but murders and public executions and oppression under Islamist regimes barely register, barely make the cut as to something that is problematic and needs to be defied. It's a selective outrage that we have been manipulated into that is just really a tool of control, a psychological leash on our public conscience. And people love to talk about how the West should apologize for the wrongdoings that they have done centuries ago. Meanwhile, slavery under Islamist rule persists, and so does oppression, as we have already talked about in this video. And this is documented. And it shows how extremist religious systems treat human beings as commodities when political power goes unchecked. I'm going to read again because this is a lot of information. So, in Mauritania, the government denied slavery existed until international pressure made denial impossible. Organizations like Anti-Slavery International found entire communities living in hereditary enslavement. Clerics claiming that obedience and hierarchy were religious mandates. In Sudan, Muslim militia groups allied with Islamist political factions enslaved tens of thousands of Black African civilians during civil conflicts. Survivors have testified about being marched into captivity branded with their captors' marks and forced into labor or sexual servitude. Decades of atrocity unfolded with minimal global outrage until conservative pressure finally dragged the issue back into view. Meanwhile, armed Islamist-aligned paramilitaries carried out systemic ethnic cleansing in Darfur, burning villages, raping women, murdering civilians, and driving millions into exile and persecuting Christian communities whose priests filmed their own towns burning while begging the West to notice. In Yemen, during an Islamist-aligned civil conflict, forced labor and domestic servitude has been documented in the thousands. Families sell children out of desperation, and captors exploit religious and tribal systems to avoid accountability. In Saudi Arabia, the narrative of wealth and progress is masking a deeper control. Women were not allowed to drive until 2018, which was a right granted reluctantly after decades of protest. And activists who fought that ban endured arrests, torture, long detentions, and abuse. I don't know how to say the name. Lujan Al-Thlul, one of the most prominent campaigners, was detained without trial, held without being able to communicate, tortured, and sexually abused by the state authorities for daring to demand autonomy over her own body. Women in Saudi Arabia still need a male guardian's permission for basic life decisions, such as marriage, travel, even leaving abusive relationships. And they face pervasive legal inequality. This is what happens when Islamic regimes that bring in Sharia law thrive. Then across North Africa and the Horn of Africa, migrant detainees, predominantly brown and black, have been sold in open markets when intercepted trying to escape poverty or conflict. Video and eyewitness reports circulated before being taken down or dismissed as isolated cases. And these are patterns of religious exploitation, of cult mentality, where power structures treat human beings as expendable. In Pakistan, accusations of blasphemy can trigger mob violence and extrajudicial death before any trial begins. Properties are burned, people are killed on the spot, and families are basically terrorized, even for alleged insults to the religion. And so accusations alone trap people into a nightmare of legal torture. And then back to Iran, for years, the state has ended people's lives whose only crime was to run atheist or secular online content that criticized religions or questioned doctrine, which as humans, we should be able to do. We should be able to talk about things and discuss doctrine and religion and what we believe in or what we don't believe in. 2 men were hanged in 2023 for running a Telegram channel that discussed religion and atheism. One was a father of 3 children, and their deaths were announced by the judicial system. And beyond these specific cases, there are already the ones that we talked about in the beginning of the video, and then that are basically these patterns of religious authority that is weaponized against human beings. These are systems of subjugation and terror and elimination, and yes, they are emotional and physical control. And they operate like cults, because ultimately these regimes are just hiding under religion, when really they're cults. Now compare that with the global response. Try to find the global outrage with the same intensity of any kind of misstep that happens in the West by Westerners. Blaming the West for every injustice in the world actually protects the oppressors, and it lets governments build on fear and avoid accountability. And it recasts violence as cultural complexity instead of what it actually is, which is systemic terror and abuse. So when human beings are treated as property and traded and terrorized and tortured, and we talk about it like it's simply a cultural complexity, oppression wins again. And I think it's about time that the world faces what these Islamic regimes do to people. Because this is not religion, it is a cult. And it must be treated as such, giving people a way out, protecting them, and helping them through recovery. Because leaving such oppressive so-called religions and recovering from brainwashing, decades of brainwashing as individuals, a hard feat. And I admire every single person who is able to do that and then be able to even speak out against that. It requires so much strength. And what the people in Iran are doing, speaking out against what they have lived, of what their ancestors have lived, of the erasure of their own culture, that is strength, and it should be inspiring to every single one of us. And this is something that we need to understand, is that before the Islamic Revolution, Iran was alive. Streets had music, and markets overflowed with color, and universities echoed with debates and humanity. Women walked freely and studied and worked and argued and laughed. Families were able to socialize without fear. Culture and science flourished. People literally lived, laughed, and loved. A girl could dream of becoming a doctor or an artist or a politician even, and nobody questioned her. Her life wasn't restricted by what she wore or what God she believed in or what she said or who she loved. Her parents trusted that society would allow her to be herself fully. Her city was vibrant, the streets were safe, and opportunities were open to her. And then the Islamic Revolution came. And from one day to the next, everything changed. Music became haram. Singing in the streets, haram. Females walking around with hair uncovered, haram. Dancing, haram. Laughing too loud in public, haram. Reading certain books, also haram. Choosing your own husband, your own path, your own life, haram. Every word and every action just measured against religious edicts. Women's bodies and minds and even their voices became monitored, and freedom vanished under the guise of prohibition and religious respect. Public life became a web of fear, and religious law became the law of the land. Women's freedoms literally changed and were lost overnight. Art and music became considered dangerous. Scientific inquiry became filtered through religious ideology, and the system trained people to obey and to self-erase. Families learned quickly that they would have to say that they're Muslim or risk their livelihood. They learned to hide their daughters. They learned to teach their sons to watch their every word. And so this is how everybody learned to obey or die, because Iran was never a Muslim majority country. But with the Islamic takeover, they had no choice. And this is not ancient history. We are living this in the 21st century. A functioning society that was thriving, that had allies in the West, and a country that people visited. A tapestry of colors and culture, like many other cultures before Islamic regimes take over. And even with a revolution now, rebuilding won't be easy. It will be possible, hopefully. But rebuilding upon the deaths of the people who used their voice because they wanted to exist, you can't bring those lives back. And the more we stay silent, the more lives disappear by the minute. And the so-called culture that Islamists often claim as theirs echoes through the cities with things that really were never Islamic art or culture. They were Persia. And now people resist. Finally, they use their voice because they've had enough of it. And for people that have lost their livelihoods a long time ago, it's like that older lady in the video I talked about. She has been dead for 40 years, so she's not afraid to die. That speaks volumes. So now women burn hijabs and protest and march. They've had enough.
This is how the Islamic Revolutionary Guard wants Persian women to look. This is how we actually look. Suck it, Ayatollah.
And what's even more beautiful is that the men stand with them. And for that courage, they also get executed. And this is Iran's story, but it's also a warning for us in the West. Basically for any society that tolerates silence in the face of ideological violence, and that refuses to confront systemic abuse until it's far too late. And for those that say that women who cover themselves up do it because it's their choice, I would suggest rethinking that, because a lot of it, if not all of it, is internalized misogyny. Live centuries long enough as a society being told that your God will love you more if you hide, and you will hide, and you will love every minute of it. Just like cults. When you spend long enough in a cult, in a group cult, or in a cult of one, you learn to cope. And one of the greatest coping mechanisms for long-term abuse is finding a silver lining and accepting it and embracing it, because it's the only way to survive. Under Islamist regimes, women's bodies are not their own, and their choices are really not theirs. Everything is controlled, from what they wear to what they say, or if they're even allowed to speak. Disobedience is punished, and often family members, their fathers, their mothers, their children, are forced to be the ones ending the lives of the women in their life that supposedly did something wrong. And this control doesn't stop at the physical aspect, because it penetrates the mind, the subconscious mind. And that's what we call internalized misogyny. It's not born all of a sudden from growing up in an environment like that. It's imprinted basically in your DNA, in your ancestral memory. It begins being erased and replaced by this understanding that you have to stay silent and modest, or your reason for living, your God, will not accept you. Women are trained from a very early age to doubt themselves, to not trust their own intuition. We talk about female intuition. People talk a lot about female intuition, which is one of the greatest things about being a woman, is having that female intuition, that gut feeling, that sharp emotional attunement. Well, in these regimes, in these cultures, women are trained to not have that anymore. They are trained to see their curiosity and their desires and their dreams as dangerous and unlawful. Basically, they learn that existing fully is a threat, not only to themselves, but to their loved ones and their entire community. It's basically a psychological prison. When you're told long enough that if you exist the way you dream of, the way you thought of, the way you imagined, even for a millisecond, if you're trained that that is wrong, that that is shameful, and everybody around you says the same thing, and you don't have an example of empowerment, you are going to embrace the oppression, because it's all you know. And I'm going to give a personal example to frame this for the people that are listening to be able to understand better. But I grew up in a cult of one, and I was raised in this cult-like mentality and control and surveillance. And I embraced it. For a while I revolted, but when the punishment became harsh enough to make me fear my own life, I embraced that. I learned to think that that was honorable, that the people that were inflicting the abuse upon me just did because they cared and loved me and didn't want me to go astray. So in that reality, as a Western woman, this is what I experienced. Although I was surrounded by people who were free, I cannot even begin to fathom what it's like to live a similar reality, but surrounded by people who are not free. But for some reason, the mainstream Western feminism often fails to see this. Maybe I shouldn't even call it feminism, because it's not really real feminism, it's performative. Iranian women are not just symbolic. You know, they're human beings who are trying to use their voice in a system that told them for every single day of their existence that they shouldn't defy and exist. And there's a topic of FGM, female genital mutilation, in which some of the survivors and advocates of Islam have gone through, have survived. Unfortunately, they went through this, and they speak of it because it's something that has become more and more a problem in the West, with an increase in Islamic groups coming to the West. There is also an increase of these atrocious acts of absolute cowardice and violence upon women. Many people have asked me, why would women do this to other women? Because this is not just men doing FGM to women, it's women. You will have several ways to cope, but one of the most popular ones will be internalizing it and accepting it, finding excuses to justify it as righteous. That is one of the ways. You will find it as necessary. And then there's the other one, which is out of revenge. If I went through it, then other people have to go through it. It is what it is. I like to think that most women that went through this perpetuate this upon other women because it's so internalized that it is the right thing to do. But if there's one thing that I cannot be indifferent to, is the fact that this has become such a systemic problem in the West that there are advertisements in the streets and awareness campaigns about how FGM is bad. It's not just FGM that is bad, it's the cult-like religion that advocates for FGM that is bad. And somehow the world is still hesitant to talk about it. This isn't just their culture, because Iran was never Islamic, it was Persian. Iran is Persia. And one of the reasons why this video might get flagged and most voices talking about this might get silenced and get silenced is because of the infamous word Islamophobia, which is a word that is manufactured and it's a skillfully deployed political weapon. Oppression is oppression, violence is violence, fear is fear, and tortures, executions, slavery, child marriage, silencing women, none of that is culture. It's brutality. And it's happening right now. And I want to get something straight. Being afraid of a cult-like religion that in its apex installs a regime that oppresses and kills is not Islamophobia. It's Islamotrauma, a term that has actually been coined by survivors of these regimes, by survivors of Islam, by ex-Muslims. And here in the West, we have this cultural relativism, whereas we're just protecting abusers and we're letting them operate without being challenged, while victims watch the atrocities that they go through being justified. And the longer we pretend that what happens in these places, in these regimes, is just cultural difference, the longer these systems survive and perpetuate and spread like wildfire. Because one thing or another thing that we have to understand about these regimes is that they do not stop at takeover. And when takeover happens and is challenged, they don't just back down and accept their loss. They love death more than life. And so bloodshed is ecstasy. And Iran shows it clearly. The perfect example of a country that was advanced, that was prosperous, and whose light was completely drowned under the guise of an extremist regime. Every person alive has some responsibility to confront this. Maybe not publicly, but in their own minds. Just for a little bit, at least. People deserve freedom and dignity, especially when they are fighting for it. One of the most beautiful trends that has come out of people being inspired by the voices of Iran, I'm going to look at it while I'm talking because I find it so inspirational, is women showing a photo of themselves, how they were forced to wear a hijab when they were children, and they were told to be silent, and they were able to escape and become themselves. And most of them have photos of themselves as children wearing hijabs, and then they have a photo of themselves or a video of themselves with their beautiful real selves coming through, whatever that is, their hair down or the clothes they want to wear or the attitude that they want to own, whatever it is. And it's a beautiful, beautiful trend. It's truly inspiring. Iran is a story of strength and resistance now. A society that functioned and thrived and lived freely, that was crushed under manipulation and ideology, where obedience was not only a suggestion, but it was enforced by death, and where resistance became punishable by death. And silence towards that is protecting murderers. It's not being respectful of culture. If there's one culture that you should respect, is Persian, not Islam. And every hour that passes without outrage, that lesson spreads that compliance is good. It gives strength to these systems. It makes them believe that they can rule the world. And this is our fight too, because anywhere where voices are cut and resistance is punished and speaking the truth results in being silenced is a place where systems like this, regimes like this, can appear from one day to the next, just like what happened to Iran. I have no problem in offending religious sensibilities when what's at stake is perpetuating abuse of women, of children, and of men who decide to stand by the women and children that they witness being abused. This is happening in Iran now, but tomorrow it could be anywhere. Let's not forget that.